Following on from last interview, where you were discussing the nature of being a seeker, what, in your opinion, differentiates the path of a seeker today from the path of seekers when you were just starting out?
I think the main difference is the wider availability of non-dual teaching, although it was always available and we managed to miss it.
Right. But also the whole notion of mysticism and mystical process is, I think, more culturally known and available now. Because when we started, these were very exotic things that had to do with Eastern religion and things like that. And a lot of the, at least terminology that was involved, is now, I think, much more assimilated in the culture.
That's right. When we started, there were a few gurus that we all...
Yeah, meditation was something the Maharishi was doing with the Beatles, remember? Meditation.
That's right, exactly. And there were, I remember seeing some references to Pir Vilayat Khan back in those days in a bookstore somewhere.
Yeah, and today people meditate on their lunch hour, and much
Buddhism, lots of Buddhism has infiltrated the society.
Yes, and now we hear a lot about mindfulness. So I'd say one of the things that might distinguish a present seeker is that they have some contact with these things, if not some experience with these things, and want
right. The notion of meditation and the relevance of inner state is just not so foreign.
Yes, I think that's true. Similarly, that's in many ways a two-edged sword, because in fact it is now so much common part of common selling. And it's such a common embedded cultural kind of understanding that it's gotten much more shallow.
Well, or it's just drawn in a wider variety of people with different levels of understanding, interest, need. I mean, New Age came along during that time. And before then, it kind of existed in the New Thought movement.
Yes, there's New Thought and Paul Quantum.
But that's an older one. New Thought was around, but nobody knew about the New Thought, except a handful of... But yeah, I mean, the dawning of the age of Aquarius, the appearance of that play, Hair, put astrology in everybody's head. So there's been a big cultural change.
The landscape is really very different.
Would you say back then were there more active seekers than they are right now?
I would say there were less. Even the notion of seeking something spiritual outside of church or synagogue.
Yes, that's true, but I'd say that the seekers in our day were in many ways more serious.
Well, they had to work harder.
Well, yes, because in order to be a seeker, you had to know some things and go out of your way to learn them. And so much of that is just part of the cultural baggage now.
Well, yeah. But I mean, that's what happens when anything has a larger number of people. Esoteric religion. Too many people.
Right.
Too many people with too many questions on too many levels.
It's interesting to think about Sheikh Isa's proposition that Christianity was really a esoteric mysticism that got popularized and had a lot of Roman law attached to it.
Right. Roman legalism and Greek references that entered, as it was originally a Jewish mysticism, if we could believe what the Bible says.
Well, yes, it would seem that it's really very esoteric, once you know that it's very esoteric.
Right. As Sheikh Isa made the point that Christianity was esotericism that became exoteric, and that Islam was mostly exoteric, and the Sufis made it esoteric. But I'm not really quite so sure that right there during the descent of the revelation, that given the miraculous, mystical nature of the phenomenon, I would imagine that Islam and its early handful of people were pretty esoteric, even though esoteric practices had not yet developed. In other words, I think they were in touch with the mystery. They had sort of direct contact with it.
I think that's a good description.
It doesn't take long to add new people and have it start getting formalized, because people ask a lot of questions and they get answers.
Do you think the questions today are different?
Well, I don't know.
Well, I don't know either. The questions I get tend to be from people who have some idea what they're looking for, and if not, have found it to some degree. I think that would be a different set of questions than somebody like Brother James might get.
Well, but who are you getting the questions from?
Well, generally from people who know about the Tariqa or belong to the Tariqa.
Right, that's already getting pretty close to inner teachings already. I think there probably are more serious seekers.
Just to add on this, would you say traditionally a seeker would normally seek within their own tradition, but now traditions have been globalized, considering that many people start out as a functional atheist and they have every religion at their fingertips to choose from? Would you say that there are more pitfalls or opportunities, the fact that there are so many traditions to choose from?
Both. It certainly works both ways.
Well, I think these days you have a lot of people who have rejected their religion of birth because it hasn't fed them well enough, and they've looked elsewhere. And then they're better able to see what they're looking for in some other tradition, and sometimes they return to their own.
Yes, we've certainly seen that. And I can relate to that easily. I grew up nominally a Christian, but I don't know that I had any real appreciation for Christianity until I'd been a Muslim for years.
We knew there was something there, but we just couldn't find any manifestation of it and didn't know what it would look like.
Say, is this being any help? Are we wandering in the right woods?
Yes. And this kind of brings me to another question. Many of us seekers are rootless and spiritually homeless. Coming to a tradition, we seek to become a part of the community, to make a home and to set down roots. Yet each tradition has its own background, its own aesthetics. Coming to Islam, which originated in a desert environment, did you ever feel apprehension about or reluctance to submit to any unique forms of Islam?
Oh, yes. Anything other than esoteric Islam would have been intolerable. And what made it so wonderful was Sheikh Issa's, what he used to call essential Islam, which is what we have in the Tariqa. One of the difficulties with Islam is not so much the desert, although the desert's part of it, is the cultures that it came from and the enormous amount of cultural baggage it carries with it. For a religion that is fundamentally about the divine unity.
At its root, universalist.
Yes, and at its root, universal. And explicitly so.
That's right. And I wanted you to be all one people?
Yes.
I found that very much of the exoteric felt oppressive. But the Sunnah made sense because it's a form of remembrance.
And this varies greatly by personal type and temperament. There are those who have come to the Tariqa and have found the world of Islam a very comfortable home to live in. There are people who have come to the Tariqa who accept the packaging. This is the package that comes in okay. And both are possible.
Yeah, I mean, it comes in a form. You can't escape some of the form.
Right. It has to have a form.
So was there any part of this form that you felt apprehensive towards or any reluctance to follow in the beginning?
Well, it's a royal pain to do the prayers. Yeah, when you've never had anything like that, that was a lot to swallow. But it could be done. And of course, you appreciate it more too. I remember when I learned about the ritual prayer, I thought, how remarkable. You can directly express the spiritual attitude. The prostration is just the idea that people actually take on those postures to indicate.
Right, here's something I can get all of myself into.
Right. Now, the only thing that I think bothered me right away was the separation of male and female, the male dominant. But of course, that's cultural in its origin.
Right.
I always felt funny when the women were sitting in a line against the wall and men were in this tight little circle doing everything.
Right, and the further we got to the east, the more pronounced that became and the more repugnant it was. I'm thinking of the conditions that the women have had to put up with in the mosque in Cairo.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, right. That's what you meant by further east. Yeah, the more we actually had direct contact with the culture, then it was harder to see the religion in its purity.
Yes, and there are a lot of natural or cultural or historical parts that just don't translate well across cultures, and I think to some degree across time.
Right. So, rootless and spiritually homeless, I never felt like I belonged to any community all of my life. With the Tariqa, I felt like I could be a member of that community, but certain things still difficult. And one of my disappointments was that it didn't fulfill. I mean, I'm not that sociable a person in the first place, but I never quite felt comfortable in the community because there was always a chance you would do something wrong.
Something against the group norm?
Well, yeah, or even just in a period of forgetfulness, behave in a way that was not considered proper adab at the, you know what I mean?
Yes, well, yes.
It felt warm and welcoming, but not forgiving.
It was very easy to come into the community because there were 13 people in the community.
And they were all young and eager and enthusiastic.
But I do remember having a few twangs of apprehension when people started talking about Sheikh Isa, describing him as infinite and the most intelligent person in the world. There's some of that kind of rock star admiration that really gave me pause for thought.
So this brings me on to a slightly different question this time, which is around music. You mentioned music as being of vital importance. What about poetry? Do you think the seeker of today can benefit from metaphysics or poetry? What is your experience, and which poets have deeply affected you, both within or outside of our tradition?
Well, poetry's been a big part of it for me all along, because I remember some of my earliest memories being connected with language and poetry. And I remember in high school and college reading poets who we now, even though they were essentially modern poets, we can now look back on and say, yes, they really know. I'm thinking of Whitman, for example, and a title of his work, which I didn't understand then but do now, and the title is Song of Myself. And what a bigger and grander meaning that has to me now than it did when I first read it. I guess I was in high school. But there was something there. There was a hint of quality. It pointed in a direction. And the same for other people you might bring to mind immediately, like Emily Dickinson, for example. And I mention Emily Dickinson just because I have recently looked one up and put it in my poetry file. And if I can find it here, I'll read it to you. Here it is. So this is Emily Dickinson. The only news I know is bulletins all day from immortality. The only shows I see, tomorrow and today, perhaps eternity. The only one I meet is God. The only street existence thus travel. If other news there be or admirable show, how come it? Yes, you've only got about 12 lines. So, I mean, the whole full of this stuff, if you look for it, it doesn't need to be Hafiz to be spiritually effective.
Right. Plenty of poetry that will give you intuition, that you recognize what they're describing, even though you've never seen it. It touches something. It rings as deep and true.
Right. And this is in many ways the best formulation of that which can't be expressed.
Right. And it's no surprise that so much scripture of the world is really poetry.
Quran, for example, the Psalms, the Songs of David.
Well, and a lot of the Hindu material, and the Quran, of course.
So, yes, poetry has always been part of my journey. I don't know about others. They find themselves more affected poignantly by music, or for that matter by drama, or for that matter by film. Why exclude any art form and its ability to reach people?
Right. Music was huge for me. Poetry was secondary. By secondary, I don't mean unimportant, but nowhere near as important to me as music.
But certainly part of your appreciation of music is its Pythagorean quality.
Yes. Oh, well, if you mean that kind of theory.
Yeah, that's what I mean, that kind of theory. Mathematics.
Yes, exactly. Right. And I did get some of that early on in understanding octaves and other intervals. I knew they had numbers attached to them.
We were talking about Pythagorean quality of music as one of those points to the divine.
Interestingly enough, I could have come into contact with that when I learned about logarithms, but I didn't. But with the Gurdjieff system, with the range of an octave, and the different intervals having different qualities. And then later I found other things. Like,
who was it who pointed us to Daniel's theory of scale? How did that happen?
Danielu?
Remember the introduction to the theory of scale, where the first chapter is metaphysical correspondences?
It may have been a footnote in something else we read that made us want it, but it was out of print.
But eventually we found it.
Yes, and it's quite a work.
Well, I couldn't read much of it because it required much more knowledge of music than I had.
It was more technical than I could handle at a certain point into the book. I could have, if I wanted to back up and get that deep into the musical theory with all these micro intervals, divisions like commas, small parts of an interval. I got the idea.
It was really a reference to how God creates the world in terms of musical scale and structure. And it was wonderful.
Later on, when we came into contact with things like Fibonacci and things like that that were found in nature, it was kind of just, oh yeah, that's great. Not, who would have thought?
Yes, that's right. That was very much the experience.
Do you feel that modern technology is a help or hindrance on the path, or neither? Please give stories and examples of ways in which it has helped or hindered you.
Well, like all phenomena, it's a good part and a bad part. All things that exist do that. I think what's important at this point in the cycle is to realize that we do live in a world of technology, and we need to deal with it and not run from it, and on the other hand, not overestimate it and give it values that it doesn't have. There's something in being a perennialist or a traditionalist that is somehow automatically opposed technology and the insistence that things were always better in the past. I'm not sure that's really true. And when I think about books, for example, which is clearly an endangered form of expression, I mean, the notion of taking ideas and putting those ideas in ink on dead trees, I mean, that's an idea that's just not going to be sustainable, particularly given the efficiency of other ways of doing things. And I hear a lot of traditionalists saying, oh, this is terrible. But I wonder what they said when books came into being.
When movable type appeared, and it became feasible to print all kinds of trash. And the labor required to copy manuscripts kind of helped guarantee that only the things that people thought were really important got duplicated and got saved and saved.
And then I can imagine arguments about how wisdom is really written on scroll. And now they're chopping it up into pages.
But even on scrolls they were in pages.
Right, but you see my point.
I do see your point, yeah. And you go back very far and you find non-literate societies with a large and rich scriptural heritage that is transmitted, or mythological, scriptural or mythological. Another thing about the two sides of technology, and I really value metaphysics for the insight that the proper direction to go is inward. And the modern world, with technology in particular, is an externalization of intelligence, an externalization of consciousness once we get to machines and now computers. But we're exteriorized and living in the shallowest part of the intellect. It's logic, it's
materiality.
Well, yeah, you could say, yeah. Just like putting speech to parchment, making it material, and writing down rather than sharing music, we've got, and not to mention the shift from quality to quantity. I mean, we're drowning in data, choking to death on it, but there's nothing much to it except quantity. So it's understandable that people like us in the Tariqa we found would be at least highly suspicious of modernity. And it is part of a continued fall of man, as it were. But that's not the only story, because there is a lot more shared. It was hard to find, is easier to find. Yeah. I mean, if you want to know about spirituality, you can find really good stuff on the internet these days. So in that sense, it's a real help. The individual who has a particular question may be able to find it on the internet, even if his guru can't answer it. If he can find it from another guru in a formulation that you can absorb. So another thing about technology is how it draws you outward. Good point. Because we live in a world, we used to live in a world of nature, a world of forms, and that's kind of natural. But our external lives only required a certain amount of attention. They might get even more, depending on how much you wanted to appreciate the beauty of nature and things like that. But it's a normal environment with the ecological interdependence of other creatures and things like that. And modern technology devours time. As it becomes more immersive, we are going to get more immersed. And I know I've certainly had a lot of distraction from it, especially being a techno nerd most of my life. And even now, I can get lost on the internet. So that's a real downside. But it's a similar downside, the fact that it became economical to print pulp fiction and all kinds of shallow material. We now have access to information of all kinds of different qualities, and more of it than anybody can possibly begin to absorb. So it draws you outward. Yes. But you venture out, you may find something of value.
Right, and there's enough out there that if you're interested, you can find things that encourage you and support you.
And can actually lead you inward.
Yes, I guess I feel like I want to say here that's true, but I also think to no small degree, real spiritual guidance is individual and personal.
And when you have it sort of like laid out before you in a certain form, you don't go through the necessary process of questioning and learning how much you can or can't trust your own mind. And in fact, you really don't have the opportunity. When you have answers already for you, you don't actually learn the discernment that is supposed to be fundamental to our Tariqa.
That's right. What you learn are answers, not process of knowing.
Yes.
And I guess for a lot of people, that's what they want. They want to be right.
Oh, sure. It's very comfortable to have an answer for everything.
Well, it may not be a very spiritually helpful place to live because you're substituting answers for the process of knowing.
And the joy of discovery.
Yes, exactly, which is progressive and builds on itself.
Having answers, I think, how education kills the sense of wonder.
Often that's true, yes.
Some of that's inevitable because when we're young and we need answers, we don't have the ability to understand, to think through and figure things out. We need answers for practical reasons. That's just part of that. That's where the journey begins. We start out with a kind of oneness as infants where we don't initially know the difference between ourselves and our environment. And we move outward and continue this process of separation between me and not me that ends up with a lot of little isolated packages of lonely people, disconnected. And then with maturity, there's the possibility to complete the cycle and start discerning anew and integrating more inwardly. Part of spiritual realization is also learning the difference between me and not me. But the first part of the cycle, we end up drawing the line at our skin, at that interface between our bodies and the rest of the world. And that completes this thing, we have to go the other direction and start working our way in from the outward parts of ourselves with the same kind of discrimination between me and not me in the process of discovering who we really are. Anyway, it's an interesting cycle. It's like an expansion and a contraction.
A good way to describe it.
It's a single breath of a lifetime.
I agree.